Newcastle United were beaten 4-2 by Brentford on Saturday and the problems are piling high for Eddie Howe. In this video I'll explain what's going wrong at Newcastle, whether they're in crisis or not, and at the end of the video I'll give my thoughts on whether Eddie Howe should be fearful for his job. Stay tuned. Hello and welcome back to another Newcastle United analysis video on the channel. Before we get into it, as always, please continue to like, share and subscribe to the channel and the videos. Help me to get to 1,000 subscribers by the end of the season. That's the aim. I'm going to postpone the podcast to the new year, but we're going to look to grow the channel in different directions. So please subscribe, like this video as well. Can we get to 50 likes to help grow the channel, help push it forward? I'm really happy with how it's going so far. Thank you for all your support, but please continue to give it. We'll get straight into the video. Newcastle were beaten 4-2, as I said in the intro, at Brentford on Saturday. Off the back of that draw with Liverpool in the week and the real momentum that gave the opportunity to build, I don't really think that many people expected Newcastle to win this game because, apart from anything else, Brentford came into this game. They've now won 7 and drawn 1 of their 8 home games and drawn 1 and lost 6 of their away games, 7 away games. They currently sit 9th in the league. So they are a Jekyll and Hyde team, a bit like Newcastle in that sense, because Newcastle can go and play big teams at St James's Park, give them a game, and then go away and perform like this. And Eddie Howe, in his press conference after the game and his interviews after the game, was clearly quite frustrated with the way that the players applied themselves. The goals were easy, they came from mistakes. And he was very, very unhappy after the game, I think. And I think a lot of Newcastle fans have criticised Eddie Howe for looking for too many positives in games, like after Crystal Palace, when, for me, as I said after that game, there weren't too many positives. And Eddie Howe was quite complimentary of that performance. There was none of that in this game. And obviously, he is the one who's facing the flack. The team selection was questioned before the game. No Sandro Tonali. He had seemed a little bit fatigued after Liverpool, but not injured. I said on the True Faith podcast, and I've said elsewhere, that Eddie Howe played Kieran Trippier into the ground at the first half of the last season when Tino Livramento was sat on the bench, and it led to a lot of mistakes in those December games at Everton and Tottenham and then Chelsea in the Cup. He seems really against the idea of playing Sandro Tonali for 2 games in a row, even though Tonali, as I said on Wednesday, it was the foundation from which that performance against Liverpool was built. And I said after that game, I thought that even though that game was built on the idea of turning the ball over, a little bit like Man City and Arsenal, and the big games are often like that, there seemed to be a sort of way you could see that happening where they could dominate the ball a bit more. As soon as Tonali comes out, that all falls apart and Newcastle never really recovered. And yes, the same thing happened. Once they don't start quickly, and Brentford are obviously extremely well known for starting quickly at home this season, if they don't start fast and they don't impose themselves first, it's very difficult for them to, as chasers, they don't react well to going behind in games. And that's exactly what happened, even though they equalised 3 minutes later after Brian Mbeumo's goal, Alexander Isak scoring, and then they equalised again in the first half and went into the break at 2-2. They never really gained that control and never looked like they could build anything, and it was Brentford who did that, and Brentford went on to win fairly comfortably in the end. And I think the big problem for me is this is a decline of a team. I think if you look at Brentford, and there's a video going around Thomas Frank after the game really sort of geeing his players up and showing the management skills he's got, a little bit like that Eddie Howe one against Manchester United on the Amazon documentary a couple of years ago. There's a lot about Brentford to like, and the caveat is that, as I said, their away form is terrible. They're a Jekyll and Hyde side, but they are sort of one of the smallest clubs in the league, punching above their weight. They've scored so many goals. Wissa and Mbeumo, I think they're the Premier League's top goal scorers off the back of Ivan Toney going. And when you think about, as I said last week, about the excuses that Newcastle have had, they're punching above their weight, they've got so many issues to deal with, they've had fatigue, they've had injuries over the last couple of years. There's always been a reason why Newcastle can struggle, and there's always been a reason why Eddie Howe has been able to shield from the criticism for himself and from the players even when it's justified. But when you look at Brentford scoring so many goals with Ivan Toney out of the team, having been sold in the summer, and the fact they haven't really replaced him with a known name. They've got Igor Thiago, who played at the weekend, but it's Visser and Mbeumo, who were there previously, who have stepped up and scored the goals for them. Newcastle haven't done enough in even with these tricky times. Yes, PSR is an issue. Yes, everything else, all of those things, fatigue and injuries have been problems in the past. Yes, they've got players who are playing above themselves. Recruitment has been poor. They haven't also done enough on the pitch. If you look at what Brentford do, they are defined in the way they play. You look at what Bournemouth do, who are also above Newcastle, they're defined in the way they play. Brighton, obviously, who have gone to another level so far this season, it looks like, even though they were pegged back by Leicester at the weekend. They have a defined way of playing that you know you're going to get. And I think Newcastle previously have had a defined way of playing. They've moved away from that, and that has sort of accentuated this decline because structure isn't quite right. Eddie Howe has made it clear that he wants to move away from the pressing and the intensity and the turning the ball over because other teams have become wise to it. They allow Newcastle to have the ball, so they can't do that all the time. Absolutely fair. But the squad and the team isn't geared up well enough to dictate the ball properly, especially when you don't play Sandro Tonali at every opportunity, because he is the key. As I said, he was the foundation of which they built around to change that system. Eddie Howe brought him in to do that, and he hasn't really had the opportunity. When he has played, it's been mangled and sort of thrown together and cobbled together alongside Bruno Guimaraes. They finally stumbled across something on Wednesday, and then they drop him, and then Newcastle revert to type. So there's a managed decline across the board. They're not intense anymore. They're not good in possession. They're not defensively stoic like they were 2 years ago. They're not great at set pieces like they were 2 years ago. They don't have goals all over the pitch like they had last season, or even 2 years ago when they had Almiron scoring the same amount of goals as Anthony Gordon did last year, and they had Callum Wilson adding goals to Isak. They've only really got Isak and then Barnes sort of coming in and scoring goals when he does either come off the bench or start games, but he isn't consistent enough with his performances and consistent enough with his game time to become a real threat. Anthony Gordon has obviously had his struggles this season, even though he scored against Liverpool. So there is a sort of real sense, I think, of managed decline across the board. The team has looked like this away from home for a long time, and this sort of performance is an amalgamation of a lack of intensity, a lack of direction with the performances. Lots of people, myself included, are talking about the mentality of the team when they go and play Liverpool and they go and play Manchester City at home in front of their fans, and it's an easy game to get up for, and they really deliver. But I also think it's tactical as well, partly. But they just revert to what they used to do. It's easy. They know what the team is stale. The team is not improved in terms of recruitment. That isn't Eddie Howe's fault. We all know this. But it's easy for those players to just revert to the intensity is our identity, high pressing, energy around the pitch, turn the ball over type of performance, because that's what they did against most teams 2 years ago. But the mental strength and the sort of dirty tactics, all the things that were sort of defined in Newcastle 2 years ago, they were very, very good at all of those things that don't take money and don't take fresh ideas and fresh players to continue with. That's an identity thing. That's a mentality thing. I think that's dropped. So this is an amalgamation and a natural decline. I'm afraid. I think that this is where this has happened. You look at West Ham a couple of weeks ago at home against a poor team. Even a goal down, they should have been able to have the confidence to come back, but they didn't. They collapsed, they faltered. West Ham got a foothold in the game, and it was enough. So it isn't just away from home, but it is most prevalent away from home that this happens. And I think it is a difficult situation for Newcastle to find themselves in. Lots of people, and I definitely include myself in this, have pushed this idea that as soon as a big player leaves, a Bruno or an Isak or a Gordon, whoever, it solves the PSR issue and they can attack the window. But I thought to myself yesterday, is that really going to be the case in the same way that it was 2 or 3 years ago when they signed Botman and Bruno and Isak? When there was a lot of promise, the project was fresh, there was a lot of money going to be pumped in, there was a lot of excitement and momentum around it. Is that going to be the case if they finish mid-table and miss out on Europe for the second year in a row? A player leaves. Are they able to go and find a player like Botman and convince them to come over someone like AC Milan as they did last time? Are they able to get a player like Isak out of Real Sociedad like they did? If they're 3 years into something that's faltering and they have all these PSR issues, are players going to think to themselves, that's the place I want to build my next stage of my career? I think it is going to be difficult. So even if a player leaves, it's going to be tough to replace them. This is a really dangerous, difficult time for Newcastle, and they do need to find a way forward to really get back into the conversation for qualifying for Europe, because otherwise it could be really catastrophic for the project. And also another point on recruitment as well. Lots of people talking about as I said, the January window, and I'll do some more videos on that in the next coming weeks. But I think the idea that they have to sell somebody to buy, and that's sort of been pushed by Eddie Howe in the last few weeks, this will require a calm head and a well-calculated, thought-out way of doing things. They're not doing that on the pitch at the moment. Clearly, they don't have a defined style and a defined a mental strength and confidence in their own play, and a way that, and they don't have the ideals and the principles that they had 2 years ago. I've said that for weeks, but off the pitch, that's kind of true as well. They went into the PSR situation at the back end of June in absolute chaos, and were lucky to get away with the way they did. And then on the final day of the window, they bid for Anthony Elanga. Can you imagine if Anthony Elanga, who's a sort of good, decent Premier League winger, but not game changing for Newcastle, if they bought him for 50 million and then went into January in desperate need of selling somebody big, that could be a crisis point. And obviously they were fielding crazy amount of bids in January last year for players as well. Everybody needs to take a step back and think about a way forward, because this isn't working on the pitch, as I said, for various different reasons, and it certainly isn't working off the pitch as well at the moment. It hasn't done for a year in both counts. I think if you go back to December last year on the pitch, that was when it went wrong at Everton, Spurs. I remember being at that AC Milan game in the Champions League. After the game, you can watch the video where I said the silver lining that Newcastle are out of the Champions League is they can attack the second half of that season, and yet they really didn't quite do that. There was always some sticky performances. They were beaten by Forest after that game in the December, beaten by Luton. They drew with Luton the following January or February, I think. They went in a crazy game. They had to come back in ridiculous fashion against West Ham. They were beaten by Manchester United, drew with Brighton. There were lots of sticky performances in that second half of the season. And then Newcastle went into the summer with a clear brief to build momentum again, and they haven't done that. So there's been lots of opportunities missed, I think. But also they do need to go back to the drawing board and really find a different way forward. I can talk about individual issues, and that Brentford got over Newcastle in certain areas, and Brentford's intensity was better. Newcastle's attitude wasn't quite right. I do think this is an overall decline on and off the pitch that has got Newcastle into this situation. It isn't a quick fix. It isn't an easy fix, and unfortunately, they've missed so many opportunities in the past to build it that this is what you get. I don't know whether Eddie Howe going or Eddie Howe staying is the right thing, but what I will say is that if you sack Eddie Howe, that isn't enough by itself. Sacking of a manager and replacing a manager are two sides of the same coin. If you could find a manager with a track record of perhaps winning trophies, but also putting a culture in place and developing players and developing a club in his image, a little bit like Eddie Howe did 3 years ago, to a different level, that would absolutely make sense. But it has to be that. There are so many examples of managers leaving and there being a knee-jerk reaction to sack the manager before there is a thought process of who to bring in. And I think Newcastle are in a difficult position where they have to find their identity for this next stage of the process. Best 11 Newcastle can play is Champions League quality. The squad certainly isn't that because of depth issues, and in terms of like players like Jacob Murphy and Sean Longstaff coming into the team when Tonali and Gordon drop out, for example, and also they've got PSR issues. So there are lots of problems for Newcastle to solve, but they are underperforming at the moment. They shouldn't be in the bottom half. They shouldn't be getting torn apart by places like Brentford, by teams that have half the wage bill that they do and have put half the investment in the team that they do. Brentford are a team with an identity, with a way forward, with a structure, with a collective mentality, and that's just not what Newcastle are anymore. They're now a team that relies on individual quality and an ability to revert to type when the conditions are correct at St James's Park against big teams as well. So I think Newcastle are in a difficult spot should they sack Eddie Howe. I don't think sacking Eddie Howe by itself solves anything. It needs to be the right man coming in. Difficult few weeks coming up. They have to beat Leicester on Saturday at St James's Park. Then there's Brentford in the Cup, and there's a good chance that they'll win that because Brentford's away from Newcastle back at St James's Park. Ipswich away just before Christmas reminds me a lot of Luton last year. Really difficult game that, and that could be a real pivotal moment because Newcastle will go into that game. They have to get themselves up mentally for that to get the victory, and it is crucial that they do, going into Villa at home on Boxing Day, which will obviously be a really difficult game. So there's some crucial weeks coming up before the January transfer window, and then obviously lots of people going in there saying Newcastle need to spend because they haven't done in the last two windows, but it has to be on the right players, and they have to find a way forward without putting themselves in danger next summer with PSR as well. So it's a really tough time for Newcastle because the decline is so vast on and off the pitch. I really apologise for being a bit negative on this video, but I think there's a lot of problems at Newcastle, as I've just mentioned. Please continue to like, share and subscribe. Thanks so much for joining me, and I'll see you later in the week for another video. Cheers.